Hey there! This podcast is brought to you by datacreators.club. It's a website I made to discover the best data content creators out there, no matter their channel, YouTube, Medium, Twitter, you name it. So go check it out and enjoy the show.
What's up, data folks? I'm Mehdio, and this is the Data Creators Club podcast. And today we have Mehdio Weingarten with us from Disney+. He's been on a writing spree on Medium since April. I don't know what his secret, but it's this kind of little gem, sharing great content from the start. So I'm super happy to have him here. So Mehdio, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you for having me, Mehdi. Appreciate it.
So can you introduce yourself? Where are you coming from and what's your career path so far?
I've been a data engineer at Disney, working within the streaming side of things like Disney+, ESPN+, and so on and so forth, for about coming on a year now. Before that, I worked at Facebook for a year. And then I got my career started at Nielsen, where I started as a software engineer, but then quickly moved into the data engineering space just based on the types of projects I was working on. And I was there for 4 years. Before that, I always knew my interest was in computer science. So that was my major in college, and I kind of just went from there and ended up becoming a data engineer and falling in love with it.
So I have a super important question before diving into data engineering topics. What's your favorite Disney?
That's hard, because Disney has just been, part of the movie experience ever since I was a little kid. So, I mean, when I was growing up, things like Toy Story and Finding Nemo and those movies were awesome. I think one of the more recent ones that I've really enjoyed is Big Hero 6. Which I thought was really good when that came out. And of course, the recent Star Wars movies, since they now have been, they're not the original prequels, but I do really enjoy them still. So I'm a fan of all of it.
So you've been working as a data engineer for a few years now. Do you feel more concerned about security? This is the topic I want to touch down today with you. And that you were before, because you wrote that blog post about security with some guideline. So how security in data has evolved according to you?
I guess considering where I was from where I was started and to where we are now, I mean, it's not like when you're first just learning about data engineering and working on projects that you're really actively concerned about security. It's kind of like an afterthought because you're just more concerned with actually figuring out how to build something and get it to work. Mm-hmm. But yeah, security is definitely something that you have to keep your eyes on, because there are just so many ways in which our information can get exposed these days. I mean, you hear the stories all the time about leaks and all these other things where our passwords, other types of information is compromised. And, we don't necessarily work on that directly as data engineers, but we still need to be concerned about it for similar reasons. I think security has definitely evolved throughout the technologies that we use as data engineers. I think any new tool or technology that's used by a large number of people, it definitely has security as one of its chief focuses, because it's impossible not to have in this day and age. Yeah.
Do you feel also a switch when, I don't know how much experience you had with on-premise, I would say, data engineering. But at least for me, when things got moved to the cloud, I got more freedom and more responsibility regarding this. Is that something that you can relate?
Yeah, I could agree with that. I mean, once you get into the cloud, you have, especially if you have, based on how your organization is structured and types of what types of permissions you can do specifically. Because I think at a lot of places now, you'll see with the cloud, you'll see a platform team who kind of leads everything, and then just kind of handles everything, and then just gives a smaller reign of control to the people who are leading those projects. But I think before that, because I think the concept of the platform team is probably more relatively new, probably something within the last 3 or 4 years, I would say, depending on my personal experience. Yeah. I think before that, though, when we were originally breaking into the cloud, it was kind of open season. And you could just do really whatever you wanted. And if you weren't if you weren't careful with what you were doing, you were just there's a possibility to have so many bad practices. But I'm sure as someone who's worked in the cloud before, that they have security built into every single service that they offer now, and it's a chief focus for any architected application.
The principle of least access. So I'm a big fan of that. So if something or someone doesn't need access, it shouldn't. Problem I'm facing it now with like data access specifically. In data world, there is a lot of exploration involved, especially for data scientists. And also they need to explore data in production, right? You cannot just give fake data like for a front-end engineer. I want to mock my apps, just give me fake data. It's fine. I can do my development feature. So when we try to lock everything too tight, don't you think we prevent that exploration and hence that innovation within the company? What's your view on that?
Yeah, I mean, there definitely is a conversation that needs to be had between the Wild West that we were in probably a while back and locking everything down and having these strict controls in place. There's a lot of good ways to enable the access and exploration of data, as long as you have a purpose for exploring it. For one, I think with the rise of like data lakes, warehouses, lake houses, all the different terms that are coming up in that space, you're not interfacing to the data layer directly. You're usually interacting with it through a metastore, which is a lot more permissible in terms of like what you can do with it. I think from a data standpoint, one of the chief things that it boils down to is like sensitivity. There's various columns and data sets that are way more sensitive than others, depending on like how your data is structured. For example, like in my experience when I was working at Facebook, I worked on a team that was working with employee-related data. So you would have some basic, demographic information. Then you would be talking about, address, salary, level, all those other things that are like we should really not have any access to. And one good thing that they did there is they would have like column-based access controls in place. Like you would specify the level of sensitivity to each column that you were building for your table. And then people would have access based on whatever permissions that they had, based on what team they were in, like any special approvals that they got to access various other things, and so on and so forth. So I think that that concept of column-based access control, you don't see it a lot right now because I think the focus is more on the row-based access or table-based access control.
Yeah, indeed.
That's gonna be an interesting one that I think is going to be developing over time. Another one that I think is usually really good, is the designation between data sets that are perfectly fine to look at, things that don't have any bad information, and PII related data sets. A good way that you can handle that is you can create a clone of the PII related data set and apply anonymization to it. Taking those PII related columns and hashing them into something that's unrecognizable, but still has a way to track it back to its pre-anonymized value if you need it for something. I think having that additional table, that of course you can open up to people, you can have higher retention and so on and so forth, so that you can use that data and then just keep the sensitive stuff for only necessary context and with a much smaller retention so that it's not used as often.
Yeah, so definitely the column-based access is like still something new, but like you mentioned Facebook, right? There is a workforce there, like quite important to set up those kind of workflow. I feel like the data providers are still not there. Maybe I think like BigQuery enables that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about the other one. Maybe I don't know if you have a.
Yeah, I mean, this is a good point. At the end of the day, when you're talking about a company that's on the scale of Facebook, they are so well built in some of these regards that these things were thought about a long time ago before other places have gotten on board. And it's going to be the job of the cloud providers and whatever tools we're using to adopt something similar over time, so that we can have that same capability in all these other companies that we have throughout the area.
Cool. Could you highlight some like classic major data components that needs security concern, according to you, like in a classic data stack, I would say?
I think there's a few different layers that we need to really focus on when you're building these applications, and making sure that, the access is restricted to the level it needs to be. The first and foremost, you got to talk about the data storage layer. I come from an AWS background mainly. So when I think of that, I think of storing data in S3, in buckets and whatnot. So making sure that those bucket policies are put in place so that only certain roles that should have access to that data. It's not wide open. Public access is shut off. Data is encrypted. Those sorts of things you can do to make sure that it's pretty well protected. You also have to think about it from like the compute layer. So when you're writing that that processing that accesses that data, it should only have the permissions that it should need. Don't just give it don't give it like star for every single service that exists out there. Give only the specific permissions that you need to the specific resources that you need to make sure that it works as intended. Usually when we're developing these things, we kind of just do a trial and error approach where we generate like the structure of the role that's needed. We test it out in a development environment. If we get some access denied error, we adjust
Open
the policy
gate, yeah.
and add just what we need, and so on and so forth until it actually works. We don't take the opposite approach where we give it everything and then restrict it down. You should, I think, nothing all the way up is probably the right approach in that regard. The last one to think about is like the warehouse metastore layer. Make sure that you have the policies and rules in place so that any sensitive data is restricted to only those who should have access to it. This can be tied into the data storage layer based on how that's all generated, but making sure that policies are in place so that it's not just wide open to everybody. You should only be able to access data that your team should have access to.
Yeah, no, it's great tips. Like that, I can totally relate. Like the star thing on permission for compute. It's also way easier to debug when there is something wrong, because if you have like just a wild star on anything and you get like, now that I'm thinking of it, I feel like everything related to, like, if we take the case of AWS, like IAM role is a lot. I mean, it's completely like underrated and overwatched, right? For like new grads. What do you think about that?
I think IAM is one of the most important services to know. It's not something you really think about too much as a data engineer, because you're thinking, hey, I have data, I'm generating applications. These are all the services I need to know. But IAM is very useful. Knowing how to generate roles, knowing what permissions you need, and automating that so that you can, just take care of that using whatever technologies you use. All those are important concepts that I think are worth knowing. And I think if you look at it, the AWS certifications, which I think a lot of data engineers go for because it's a good one to have on a resume, they definitely dive in on IAM a lot in there because it's such an important topic.
Yeah, it's maybe something that you wouldn't die for with a side project, right? Because actually you don't really matter of it, right? It's just like a playground. So maybe it's overreach. So that's a good tip, like invest a bit more time in IAM, and I can totally relate to that, especially where we're talking about like, those platform teams that provide you access. They usually even work with more advanced setup with federated policy, right?
Yep.
To give you boundaries. So you need to understand like, okay, how does that work, and how actually, what's my perimeter of freedom over there, and what do I need to know to request an additional access. Yes.
Yeah, I think at Disney we actually do this pretty well. Our console access, except for like a sandbox environment, is really restricted. We have the ability to see things, but we can't make changes to it directly. When we need to make changes to something, we go through our code base, which is entirely done in Terraform. So we make changes to our roles. We go through the deployment process to take care of that so that it actually gets taken care of. And, we have to get approvals. If it's anything related to data specifically, we have to go through the governance team to make sure, hey, this is our project. For this, we need to have access to this data. If we need any special approvals, we need to go through them too. So I think we have a pretty good system in place. A few years ago when I was doing similar development, we definitely didn't have it like, I think, in a state that we do now. That just goes to show that security has definitely become more of an important focus. And I think these teams, although it can be a little bit of a headache sometimes, I won't be completely unbiased and say I haven't had my clashes with governance or platform teams before, but they're there for a good purpose and making sure that things stay under control.
Maybe we can talk a bit about this automation, because I think like that's removed the frustration, right? Like if you need to have like opening a ticket and justify why you did this, and then you have someone that does this, and need to apply those things, then that can take like a lot of time, right? Even for a small change, or maybe you just want to try it out. But if you have the things automated, like as you described, right? I guess like you have a repo, you can maybe do a PR, and the discussion is happening over there. Maybe there is a Slack channel, but those things like those process and those automations speed up the access. And I feel like on my side, at least as a consumer, I get less frustrated. What about you?
Yeah, I think and a lot of what you just described is what we have. When we're making changes, we go through the proper code review process. And I think this is important. I think when you're developing these applications, code review is so important, especially when it comes to something like security, to make sure you have the access that you need and that everything's going to be covered so that when you do deploy something, it doesn't just give you some failure. Having more sets of eyes on it is better than just having one. When we have these changes, we put them in a Slack channel for review. We have any conversation that we need related to that, and then it's pretty straightforward. We get an approval, and we're good to deploy it.
Do you actually work on such a process setup as a more data platform team to give access to data warehouse, or to basically on the other side of the consumer, from the data consumer side?
From the consumer standpoint, what we do is we normally enable accessing that data through like our Databricks environment. So our Databricks environment is connected to our Glue Metastore, so that basically you can query anything you need from that. Whatever role that your Databricks cluster is using is going to determine which databases you're going to have access to specifically. But I think we have a pretty good setup in that regard to make sure that from a consumer standpoint, especially those who don't really know what platform is or governance or any of this, they don't have to question anything. They'll have their data delivered to them.
If we double that on GDPR, what's your biggest challenge for you, because you work in the US? How are you impacted? And where do you see the biggest challenge ahead, still to be solved to be GDPR compliant in general? Yeah. I would say not really specific to Disney Plus.
I think the good thing about these regulations, GDPR, CCPA is a big one in the US. I think it's the California something Protection Act. It's certainly very relevant here too. I think what's important for this is having some sort of automated scanning auditing tool that can basically, point out any violations in your data sets according to these regulations. I think having that in place will definitely help ease any confusion, doubts in this regard. And some places aren't there yet, but I think the ones that are just make it such an easier process for developing applications and knowing that they're secure from a government standpoint.
Yeah. And again, I feel like as long as the cloud provider or the data SaaS provider doesn't give us that, as a service, we're going to need to do some building things in-house, right? Talking on open source subject, because we use a lot of open source as data engineer. We mentioned Databricks and Spark. So how do you see the security concern over there, and how can we address this, I would say, on a day-to-day basis?
These open source technologies, they have to have security as one of their chief concerns, because when they're talking to, companies who are interested in taking up their technologies, they have all these conversations, and the companies will definitely come with questions about security, because it's very important. How do we know that you don't have any unwanted access to our data? How do we make sure that we keep everything secure? Those conversations happen all the time. So it's important for those open source technologies to address that. For whatever the use case is for that specific technology, they have federation built in. They make sure it's limited access. They have the same constraints that we have to build into our applications built into theirs as well. So I think this is definitely something that's got evolved, because I don't think as an open source technology you can really cut it if you're not addressing security properly at this stage of the game.
But that's for companies open source products that are backed by strong companies. I think Databricks is a good example. But right. There is a ton of libraries in Python that we are using. Do you have any tips for that, to not overwatch security on that? Because this is just some folks maintaining the product, and so how can I make sure that I can trust actually that library?
I think documentate. I think all these libraries, especially based on how popular they are, there's a lot of good documentation for them, and they'll definitely touch on that and any secret things you need to do. I think if you just do your research before diving into something, then you'll often find the answer to your question. Is this going to handle what I need, and make sure it does it securely, so that you don't break open any doors you don't want to, and then hear about it, weeks or months later when your thing is in production. But we shouldn't be doing it for all these reasons. What
do you recommend for data engineer to keep up with security best practice and learn? I mean, we talked about IAM, AWS IAM, or any cloud provider, I would say resource that concern access management. That's important to know. But apart from that, what would be your recommendations?
Yeah, I mean, I just not to speak strictly about security, but I think in general for data engineers to stay up to date, some resources that I recommend. I think the r/data engineering community on Reddit is really good. There's always a bunch of good material on there. Not a popular subreddit by any means, but there's definitely a lot of good, interesting conversations that come out of that. And I've learned about some new things from that as well that I've been able to apply to work that have, I think, definitely provided some benefits for us. LinkedIn is good a tool just because I think they're, and this is what you touched on with your website. There's a lot of different people who write some interesting posts on there. You can definitely take some learnings from that. Their blog posts on Medium that they usually share are also very useful. Your cloud provider's blog posts or documentation is always really good. One thing that I try to do multiple times a week is read up on AWS blog posts just to see any good data engineering related topics, because you'll learn about a lot of different things that way because they release features all the time.
Yeah.
Especially related to security. So that stuff is consistently getting pumped out by them.
Yeah, I can't. I definitely like I think it get a lot of traction those past months or year or so. The Reddit data engineering, I really like it because I feel it's more a technical place than LinkedIn, and I don't know, people speak up
I
more
think,
freely.
LinkedIn is just for more basic discussions. But if you really want to dive into details, that's a good place. They link a bunch of good posts in there which get really technical too. Some of which go over my head sometimes, but a lot of which are lead to a lot of interesting conversations. So it's definitely something to check out if you're really wanting to stay up to date in this industry, which you need to in order to keep going, because data engineering is just something that moves so fast.
All right. Thank you, Mehdio. Closing up with you. So what are your next challenge, like engineering challenge or content creation? Because you've been starting pretty hard on Medium. Yeah, are you going to be able to keep up the pace?
Yeah, that's definitely not a pace I can keep up forever. I think at first I was like, wait, here are all these different things I can write about. Let's just write them all at once. And I didn't do a good job of pacing myself, because now I'm definitely at a point where I was like, okay, I don't really know what to talk about. So it definitely takes a lot more brainstorming now than it did then, just because I had all these things on my head and I just kept blasting it out day after day. In terms of what I'm doing at work, just besides day-to-day work-related things, I think one thing that I'm really looking into as a important topic is data observability. Making sure that your data is delivered with quality, making sure it's delivered with timeliness and it's reliable. There was a really good talk from Monte Carlo that I listened to as a part of the Airflow Summit. It was a really good talk. I definitely took a lot out of that. And I think when you, I think every year in data engineering, there's a set of hot keywords that people talk about. I think data observability and the focus of data as a product is something that's going to be very relevant, for this year, maybe next year, or however long it takes to really build that throughout companies, because it's unavoidable at this stage of the game. Data is just such an important part of the business that you need to focus on it as such. So that's kind of what I want to build towards in order to making sure we have that in place so that we, treat data as such, and we're making sure that it's delivered with all the necessary dimensions that we need to check off.
So Mehdio, thank you again for being on the show. I'm looking forward to your next content, and see you around.
Yes, thank you for having me, Mehdi. Appreciate it. And everybody check out his podcast. I'm looking forward to seeing the series when it goes live.